Iran is dealing with one of its worst droughts as officials warn that dam reservoir levels have dropped below 3% in Mashhad.
Residents in Iran's capital are praying for rain in the midst of a severe drought.
Iran is described by its own experts as standing on the edge of a systems breakdown. In the same week that residents of Tehran filmed dry taps and brown trickles of water, drivers in Mashhad complained about stalled traffic lights in blacked-out intersections, and families in Isfahan sat in apartments without cooling as temperatures climbed above 40 degrees. What used to be separate crises, drought in the countryside or a brief summer power shortage, are now colliding at the same moment in the same cities, turning daily life into a fragile experiment that could fail at any time. Before we continue, hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. In Tehran, a metropolis of more than 10 million people, water engineers quietly talk about a deadline. After 6 consecutive years of weak rains and record heat, the main reservoirs feeding the capital are at historic lows. International coverage has reported that some of the dams supplying the city are only a small fraction full, with senior officials warning that without new rainfall, the government will be forced to impose strict rationing and may even contemplate partial evacuation of districts that cannot be served at all. Behind the careful language of conservation campaigns lies a blunt reality. The system was never designed for this combination of climate stress and political neglect. The crisis is not limited to the capital. In Mashhad, a religious hub in the northeast and one of the largest cities in the country, residents have faced intermittent water cuts and pressure drops as authorities divert limited supplies between neighborhoods. Local reports describe people filling storage barrels at night when the pipes briefly come alive, then rationing every liter through the day. In Isfahan, once famous for its river and historic bridges, the waterway has repeatedly run dry in recent years, leaving dust in place of blue currents and igniting demonstrations by farmers who say their share has been sacrificed to industrial users and politically connected projects. What turns a water shortage into a total system failure is the way it drags electricity down with it. Iran relies heavily on dams and river flows, not only for drinking water and irrigation, but also for power generation, so every meter of lost storage weakens both sectors at once. When the reservoirs shrink, turbines slow or stop. At the same time, hotter summers and harsher winters push demand for air conditioning and heating higher than before. Analysts of the country's energy sector note that the gap between supply and demand has widened into a structural deficit, with authorities forced to schedule rolling blackouts that now affect most provinces for hours at a time. In some seasons, schools and government offices have been ordered to close or move online just to cut electricity consumption, and public buildings have shut during cold snaps or heat waves to ease pressure on the grid. Industrial plants in provinces like Fars and Isfahan have reduced shifts or halted production because gas deliveries were interrupted and power was unreliable. Reports from energy observers describe entire stretches of highway thrown into darkness, with even crucial routes out of Tehran experiencing full-day outages as transmission lines failed and power stations went offline for lack of fuel. The physical hardware carrying this load is old, under-maintained, and often built for another era. Many of the thermal power plants that were constructed in the boom years after the revolution are now decades past, the age at which similar stations elsewhere are refurbished or retired. The distribution grid leaks a notable part of the electricity it is supposed to deliver, lost as heat along outdated lines and transformers. Water pipes beneath the cities tell a similar story, corroded, cracked, and patched repeatedly instead of replaced, allowing precious treated water to seep into the ground, even as households face rationing. Layered on top of aging infrastructure is a pattern of governance that many Iranian and international analysts describe as fragmented and opaque. The state remains the main buyer of electricity, setting prices that barely cover costs and accumulating debts to private operators, which discourages investment in upgrades or new capacity. In the water sector, a dense network of agencies, provincial bodies, and powerful quasi-military conglomerates has shaped decisions on where dams are built, which rivers are diverted, and which industries are granted access to scarce supplies. Critics have labeled this web a kind of water mafia, not in the sense of a single secret organization, but as a loose coalition of interests that profit from concrete and steel. The result has been a surge of dam construction across an arid landscape without enough regard for long-term sustainability. Over several decades, hundreds of large and medium reservoirs have been erected on rivers that once fed lakes, wetlands, and downstream farms. dams. Environmental specialists warned that many of these structures were sited in highly evaporative basins or on geologically unsuitable formations. But construction went ahead, often under the management of entities linked to the Revolutionary Guard and its engineering arms. In some widely criticized cases, dams raised across saline formations caused stored water to become increasingly salty, damaging farmland and accelerating the very land degradation that forces people to leave. Climate change acts as an amplifier for every one of these choices. Scientific assessments show that Iran has warmed faster than the global average, with more frequent heat waves and shifts in rainfall patterns that concentrate precipitation into shorter, more violent events. Instead of steady snowpack in the mountains feeding rivers through the year, there are flash floods followed by long dry spells. This means dams designed around past hydrological data no longer receive the flows their planners expect, while at the same time evaporation from their surfaces increases under hotter skies, silently subtracting millions of cubic meters of usable water each season. These environmental shocks translate directly into human movement. International organizations tracking climate-linked migration estimate that tens of thousands of Iranians have been displaced in recent years by drought, dust storms, and the collapse of local agriculture. Villages in provinces like Khuzestan, Sistan, and Baluchistan, and parts of Kerman have seen wells fail and soils turn to crusted salt, pushing residents toward already stressed cities. Some arrive in informal settlements on the outskirts of Tehran, Isfahan, or Mashhad, where access to formal water and electricity connections is precarious and often dependent on unofficial payments or improvised hookups. As rural families move into these expanding urban edges, the strain on basic infrastructure grows heavier than planners anticipated. The arrival of new residents increases demand for water drawn from already depleted aquifers and heightens electrical load on transformers that were never designed for such density. Municipal engineers quietly acknowledge that parts of the network function at emergency limit, where a single failed pump or blown fuse can cascade into hours of outage across multiple districts. In winter, when cold air blankets the plateau and gas supplies tighten, even brief interruptions can leave entire neighborhoods without heating, deepening public frustration. This frustration has repeatedly spilled into the streets. Demonstrations sparked by empty taps or unexpected blackouts have broken out in areas far beyond traditional centers of political dissent. People gather first to demand basic services, holding containers in dry square or chanting outside municipal buildings where officials insist the shortages are temporary. As hours stretch into days, these gatherings often shift from local complaints to direct criticism of national decision-making. Security forces sometimes respond with heavy measures, reflecting the fear that a protest about water or electricity can quickly ignite broader unrest in a society already under significant economic pressure. Iran's transport sector offers another window into systemic stress. Rail lines that carry freight between industrial hubs suffer from aging locomotives and irregular power supply, causing delays that ripple through supply chains. Roads built decades ago buckle under heavier traffic and rising temperatures, forcing emergency repairs that divert funds from long-term planning. When blackouts disable traffic lights in major intersections, gridlock traps buses for hours and slows emergency vehicles. Observers of Iran's economy argue that chronic underinvestment is at the heart of these failures. Subsidies that keep electricity and water prices low leave utilities with limited revenue to modernize their networks, while economic sanctions restrict access to advanced technology and external financing. Budget deficits push the state to delay maintenance, resulting in equipment running well past its intended lifespan. The margin between stability and collapse grows smaller each year, leaving planners with fewer tools to manage stress. Environmental degradation accelerates this decline in ways that are only now being fully understood. As aquifers are drained beyond their natural recharge rates, land in several provinces has begun to sink. Satellite measurements reveal subsidence in areas near major cities, where the ground lowers by several centimeters each year. This slow, uneven descent damages roads, pipelines, and building foundation, creating new costs for municipalities already overwhelmed by water and power shortages. Cracked pavements and fractured sewage lines allow contamination to seep into soil and rivers, compounding public health risks in regions that struggle with limited medical facilities. The depletion of surface water is equally severe. Rivers that once supported agriculture and industry are now reduced to narrow channels or dry beds for much of the year. Farmers dependent on predictable flows discover that their irrigation channels run empty during critical planting periods. The loss of agriculture weakens local economies, increases food prices, and forces the state to import more staple, further straining foreign currency reserves. Each failed harvest represents not only economic loss, but also the erosion of social structures built around rural life. In coastal areas of southern Iran, rising temperatures and persistent drought intensify demand for electricity to power desalination plants that convert seawater into drinkable supplies. Yet the same heat reduces the efficiency of thermal plants and increases the frequency of equipment breakdowns. This paradox creates a cycle in which electricity shortages limit water production, and water shortages drive up energy consumption through the need for cooling systems and emergency transfers. Residents in these regions sometimes receive water for only a few hours each day, forcing them to store supplies in rooftop tanks that quickly heat under the sun. Analysts describe a pattern where influential groups, often linked to powerful institutions, secure priority access to water for industries, sort of farms, or construction projects that benefit them financially. Critics argue that such arrangements divert resources from ordinary citizens and undermine transparent management. Mismanagement of dams plays a central role in the deterioration of Iran's hydrological balance. Many large dams were constructed with the expectation of consistent inflows that no longer exist. Urban planners face the challenge of accommodating populations that grow even as resources shrink. New housing developments advertise modern amenities, yet many rely on outdated pipes and pumps connected to overextended networks. During outages, water trucks navigate narrow streets to deliver emergency supplies, but distribution is uneven and often insufficient. Households with financial means install private filtration systems and generators, while lower-income families endure the full impact of rationing. Hospitals confront similar disparities. In periods of intense heat or cold, emergency rooms fill with patients affected by dehydration, respiratory conditions, or carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heating solutions. Medical staff work under immense strain as life-saving machines strain power systems already stretched to their limits. Concerns grow that prolonged outages could render certain treatments impossible in regional hospitals, forcing patients to travel long distances for care they should receive closer to home. In many towns across central and eastern Iran, residents describe a daily rhythm defined by anticipation of the next outage. People wake before dawn to fill containers in case water cuts arrive early, charge phones and lanterns during brief periods of electricity, and rearrange work or school tasks around unpredictable schedules. Shops rely on small generators that rumble through narrow streets, emitting fumes that coat nearby buildings in a thin layer of soot. Rising temperatures will increase evaporation from reservoirs and soil, while shifting storm tracks may reduce snowfall in mountain ranges that traditionally supplied a significant portion of annual river flow. Without consistent snowmelt, rivers surge briefly during storms and then decline to trickles for months. This forces water authorities to release limited stored supplies earlier than planned, leaving storage depleted during late summer and early autumn when demand peaks. Each cycle tightens the constraints on both water and electricity, strengthening the feedback loop that leads to system-wide stress. Agricultural regions face similar trajectories. As wells run dry and surface water dwindles, farmers resort to drilling deeper into aquifers that took centuries to form. Pumps strain to pull water from greater depths, consuming more electricity at the very moment when shortages spread across the grid. This dynamic pits agricultural needs against residential consumption, with authorities compelled to limit power to farms during peak hours. The resulting decline in production deepens food insecurity, raises dependence on import, and places additional burdens on a national budget already stretched by subsidies and crisis management programs, making cities more dependent on air conditioning and cooling systems. Yet these systems draw heavily on electricity, which becomes less available during heat waves. When outages strike, indoor temperatures rise rapidly, especially in older buildings without proper insulation. Vulnerable populations, including children and the elderly, face the greatest risks. Health agencies issue warning, but their ability to mitigate harm is limited when basic utilities are unreliable or inaccessible. Transport networks become vulnerable during such episodes. Traffic congestion worsens when signals go dark, and road surfaces soften under extreme heat, leading to cracks and potholes that slow movement even after temperatures fall. Each disruption sends economic ripples through markets and workplaces, as delays reduce productivity and destabilize small businesses that operate on narrow margins. Companies that rely on refrigerated storage confront immediate losses when outages exceed backup capacity. When power fails, Water pumps stop, cutting access to drinking supplies and irrigation. Schools occasionally close when classrooms become too hot or cold for safe instruction. Clinics struggle to maintain vaccines that require consistent refrigeration. Over time, these hardships drive rural residents towards cities, reinforcing the cycle of overcrowding and straining urban infrastructure beyond its limits. Government agencies have announced periodic initiatives to modernize power plants, expand renewable energy, and improve water distribution systems. Some solar and wind projects have made progress, particularly in regions with high insulation and strong seasonal winds. Yet these installations cover only a small fraction of national demand. Meanwhile, delays in upgrading transmission lines and substations reduce overall efficiency. Engineers point to outdated control systems and insufficient maintenance budgets as obstacles that prevent the grid from adapting to contemporary climatic and demographic reality. Behind each technical challenge lies a broader economic context. Inflation erodes household purchasing power, making it difficult for families to invest in private alternatives, such as home filtration units, rooftop solar panels, or backup batteries. Public companies responsible for water and power struggle to finance projects when currency volatility inflates the cost of imported components. Sanctions restrict access to international technology, compelling reliance on aging domestic production lines. Despite these constraints, civil society groups, academics, and local activists have attempted to raise awareness about sustainable practices. They promote water-saving technology, advocate for revised agricultural policies, and encourage more transparent resource management. However, without structural reforms at higher levels, these efforts face significant barriers. Large-scale industries continue to consume vast quantities of water and electricity, often under favorable contracts that shield them from the rationing imposed on households. Critics argue that redistributing these burdens more equitably is essential to preventing further deterioration. At the same time, demographic pressure continues to build. Iran's population, though exhibiting slower growth than in past decades, remains concentrated in a handful of metropolitan regions where infrastructure is most strained. As internal migration flows from rural to urban areas accelerate, city governments confront challenges in housing, sanitation, road maintenance, and waste management. Informal settlements expand in peripheral zones that lack proper drainage and utility connection, increasing exposure to flooding during rare but intense storms. These vulnerabilities intertwine, turning environmental shocks into humanitarian emergencies that exceed local response capacity. Regional geopolitics compounds these difficulties. Tensions with neighboring states complicate cooperative water management on shared rivers, limiting opportunities for joint conservation or restoration efforts. Disputes over dam construction and river diversions fuel political friction that hampers unified planning across borders. Meanwhile, international organizations stress that without coordinated action, droughts and extreme weather events will increasingly undermine regional stability. In this context, Iran's domestic infrastructure challenges are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern in which climate stress and governance constraints converge to produce cascading failures.